There are moments in life when a single discovery can transform an ordinary man into a target for elimination. Sometimes, being in the wrong place at the wrong time isn't just bad luck, it's a death sentence. This is the true story of Michael Sullivan, a hard-working mason from Boston who stumbled upon a secret so dangerous that powerful people were willing to kill to keep it buried. What you're about to hear is the minute-by-minute account of the last 24 hours of a man who chose to do what was right, even when he knew it would cost him everything. This is a story of corruption that reached the highest levels of government, organized crime that operated with impunity, and one man's final act of courage that would expose the truth, even as it claimed his life. Chapter 1. Michael Patrick Sullivan was born on St. Patrick's Day, 1962, in the heart of South Boston, a neighborhood where Irish heritage ran as deep as the harbor waters and family loyalty was considered more important than personal ambition. His father, Patrick Sullivan, had been a union mason for 37 years before a construction accident left him with a permanent back injury that ended his career but not his passion for the craft. From the time Michael could hold a trowel, his father was teaching him that masonry wasn't just about laying bricks. It was about building something that would last long after the builder was gone. Michael grew up in a 3-bedroom house on West Broadway, where the sounds of the neighborhood, children playing in the streets, the distant whistle of ships in Boston Harbor, and the eternal arguments about the Red Sox provided the soundtrack to a childhood that was simple, predictable, and happy. His mother, Catherine Sullivan, worked as a school secretary and made sure that Michael and his 2 younger sisters understood that education and hard work were the keys to success in America. By the time Michael graduated from high school in 1980, he had already made his decision about his future. While his classmates were planning for college or military service, Michael was apprenticing with his father's old construction crew, learning the ancient art of stonework and developing the reputation for precision and reliability that would define his entire career. Michael married his high school sweetheart, Mary Catherine O'Brien, in 1985, and they settled into a comfortable life in the same South Boston neighborhood where they had both grown up. Mary worked as a nurse at Boston Medical Center, while Michael built his reputation as one of the most skilled and trustworthy masons in the city. They had 2 children, Patrick, born in 1987, and Bridget, born in 1990, and their life was everything that Michael's parents had taught him to value: stable, honest, and grounded in family and community. Sullivan Masonry, the small company Michael established in 1988, specialized in historic preservation and high-end residential work. Michael had a particular talent for working with the kind of old stonework that characterized Boston's most prestigious buildings, and his client list included some of the city's most influential families and institutions. He had worked on the restoration of Fenway Park, the repair of historic churches throughout the city, and the renovation of Beacon Hill mansions that had been built when America was still a young nation. Michael's reputation was built on more than just technical skill. In a city where construction projects were often plagued by delays, cost overruns, and quality problems, Michael Sullivan was known as a man whose word was his bond. When he gave a completion date, the work was finished on time. When he provided a cost estimate, there were no surprise charges or hidden fees. When he guaranteed his work, clients knew they would never have to worry about that project again. It was this reputation for reliability and discretion that brought Michael to the attention of Morrison Construction in October 1995. Morrison was one of the largest construction companies in New England, with contracts that ranged from highway projects to federal government buildings. They had been awarded a contract for what was described as a specialized federal facility in an industrial area of South Boston, and they needed a mason with security clearance and absolute discretion. The project manager, James Morrison himself, met with Michael in his office overlooking Boston Harbor. Morrison was a well-dressed man in his 50s, who spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling large, complex projects. "Mr. Sullivan," Morrison said, "this is a federal project that requires the highest level of security and confidentiality. I can't tell you many details about the nature of the facility, but I can tell you that it's related to national security and that the work must be completed quickly and quietly." Michael studied the preliminary plans that Morrison showed him. The project involved building what appeared to be a large underground storage facility with massive concrete walls and specialized ventilation systems. The masonry work would be complex and demanding, requiring the kind of precision that Michael was known for. "Mr. Morrison, this looks like serious work. What kind of timeline are we talking about?" 6 weeks, start to finish. "And Mr. Sullivan, I need to be clear about something. This project requires absolute silence. You cannot discuss it with anyone, including your family. The federal government takes security very seriously, and any breach of confidentiality could result in serious legal consequences." The pay Morrison offered was more than Michael typically made in 6 months of regular work. The project would secure his family's financial future and allow him to take on the kind of high-profile restoration work that he had always dreamed of doing. There was only one unusual requirement. Michael would have to work alone, without his usual crew, and he would have to complete all work during overnight shifts to avoid drawing attention to the project. Michael accepted the contract and began work on Monday, October 23, 1995, at 11 p.m. The construction site was located in an industrial area near the South Boston waterfront, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with razor wire and guarded by security personnel who checked his identification every night before allowing him to enter. The work site itself was more sophisticated than anything Michael had ever seen. The underground facility extended nearly 40 feet below ground level, with concrete walls that were over 3 feet thick and reinforced with steel beams that would have been appropriate for a bank vault or military bunker. Michael's job was to install a specialized brick and stone facing over the concrete walls, creating what Morrison had described as climate control and aesthetic enhancement. For the first 2 weeks, the work proceeded exactly as planned. Michael arrived at 11 p.m. each night, worked until 7 a.m., and made steady progress on the stone facing that would cover the massive concrete walls. The security guards were polite but distant, and the few other workers on the project seemed to follow the same rule of silence that Morrison had emphasized during their initial meeting. But it was during the 3rd week of the project that Michael began to notice things that didn't quite make sense. The ventilation system being installed in the facility was far more sophisticated than would be necessary for simple storage. The electrical systems included backup generators and uninterruptible power supplies that suggested the facility would be operating critical equipment around the clock. Most puzzling of all, the facility included what appeared to be holding cells or containment areas that looked more like a prison than a storage facility. Michael's uneasiness grew when he overheard conversations between the project supervisors that mentioned subjects, processing, and disposal in ways that suggested they weren't talking about construction materials. But it wasn't until the night of November 13, 1995, that Michael discovered what the facility was really intended for. Michael was working in the deepest section of the underground facility, installing stonework around what had been described as a specialized storage area, when he noticed that one section of the concrete wall sounded hollow when he tapped it with his hammer. Professional curiosity led him to investigate further, and what he found behind that hollow section of wall would haunt him for the remaining hours of his life. Behind the false wall, Michael discovered a room that contained evidence of activities that had nothing to do with national security or legitimate government operations. The room contained chemical processing equipment, industrial-grade incinerators, and most shocking of all, human remains that had been embedded in concrete that was still partially wet. Michael stared at what was clearly evidence of murder and body disposal, his mind racing to understand what he had stumbled into. The specialized facility wasn't being built for the federal government. It was being built as a sophisticated operation for organized crime, a place where people could be eliminated and their bodies disposed of without any trace ever being found. As Michael stood in that hidden room, surrounded by evidence of multiple murders, he realized that his life had just become forfeit. He had discovered something that powerful people had killed to keep secret, and now he knew too much to be allowed to live. The clock on the wall showed 3:47 a.m. Michael Sullivan had approximately 20 hours to live. Chapter 2. The first 6 hours after Michael Sullivan's discovery would prove to be the most crucial of his life, as he transformed from an unwitting accomplice into a target for elimination, and finally into a man determined to ensure that the truth would survive, even if he didn't. Michael's initial reaction to finding the hidden room was disbelief, followed quickly by horror and then by a survival instinct that had been honed by 33 years of living in South Boston, where people learned early that some knowledge was dangerous and some secrets were worth killing for. He carefully photographed everything he could see using a small camera he carried for documenting his work, then quietly replaced the false wall section and returned to his normal duties. But Michael knew that his behavior had already changed in ways that trained killers would notice. His hands were shaking as he worked, his breathing was irregular, and he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder. At 4:15 a.m., he made a decision that probably saved his life, at least temporarily. He told the security guard that he was feeling sick and needed to leave early. The guard, a heavy-set man named Tony Marcelli, who spoke with a thick Boston accent, studied Michael's face carefully before responding. "You look like hell, Sullivan. Go home, get some rest. But remember what Morrison told you about keeping your mouth shut about this project." Michael drove home, through the empty streets of South Boston, his mind racing through the implications of what he had discovered. The facility wasn't just a body disposal operation. Based on the sophisticated equipment he had seen, it was designed to handle multiple victims on a regular basis. Someone was planning to use it as a permanent solution for eliminating people who posed a threat to their operations. At 5:30 a.m., Michael sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, trying to decide what to do with the knowledge that was almost certainly going to get him killed. Mary was upstairs sleeping, and his children were safe in their beds, unaware that their father had accidentally become the most dangerous man in Boston. Michael's first instinct was to call the police, but his South Boston upbringing had taught him to be suspicious of law enforcement, especially when it came to projects that involved large amounts of money and powerful people. If the facility was being built with the knowledge and cooperation of corrupt officials, calling the Boston Police Department could be signing his own death warrant. At 6 a.m., Michael made his first attempt to contact someone who could help him. He called the FBI field office in Boston and asked to speak to someone about a federal crime he had witnessed. The agent who took his call listened to Michael's story with what sounded like genuine concern and scheduled a meeting for later that morning. But it was while Michael was on the phone with the FBI that he noticed the black sedan parked across the street from his house, with 2 men inside who seemed to be watching his front door. The men weren't trying to hide their presence. They wanted Michael to know he was being watched. At 6:30 a.m., Michael kissed his sleeping wife goodbye and left for his scheduled meeting with the FBI, but he took a circuitous route through South Boston that allowed him to confirm what he already suspected. He was being followed by professionals who had no intention of letting him reach federal agents alive. The black sedan stayed 3 cars behind him, changing drivers at red lights, in a coordination that suggested military or law enforcement training. When Michael deliberately missed his turn toward the FBI office and instead drove toward downtown Boston, the sedan followed, confirming that his watchers weren't interested in where he was going. They were interested in preventing him from getting there alive. At 7:45 a.m., Michael made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of going to the FBI office, he drove to the offices of the Boston Globe newspaper and asked to speak to an investigative reporter. The security in the newspaper building and the number of potential witnesses made it impossible for his pursuers to eliminate him without creating a major public incident. Michael spent an hour with investigative reporter Catherine Ryan, showing her the photographs he had taken and explaining what he had discovered at the construction site. Ryan was a veteran journalist who had covered organized crime in Boston for over a decade, and she immediately understood the significance of what Michael had found. "Mr. Sullivan," Ryan said, studying the photographs, "what you've discovered is evidence of what appears to be a sophisticated murder and body disposal operation. But more importantly, the location and the federal contracts involved suggest that this operation has protection at very high levels of government." Ryan explained to Michael that several federal officials in Boston had been suspected of corruption for years, but that evidence had always been impossible to obtain because witnesses had a habit of disappearing or changing their stories. Michael's photographs and testimony could be the key to exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Boston's political and law enforcement establishment. "But Mr. Sullivan, I have to tell you that coming forward with this information is probably going to put your life in serious danger. The people behind this operation have killed to protect their secrets before, and they won't hesitate to kill again." At 9 a.m., Catherine Ryan called FBI Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, a federal agent who specialized in political corruption and organized crime. Agent Mitchell agreed to meet with Michael immediately, but she insisted that the meeting take place at a secure location rather than at the FBI office, which she explained might be compromised by the same corruption that Michael had discovered. But it was while Michael was waiting for Agent Mitchell that he received the phone call that confirmed his worst fears and started the countdown to his death. The call came at 9:23 a.m., just as Michael was beginning to hope that he might be able to survive this situation by cooperating with federal authorities. "Mr. Sullivan." The voice was calm, professional, and spoke with the kind of authority that comes from years of giving orders that are never questioned. "You've seen things that you shouldn't have seen, and you've talked to people you shouldn't have talked to. You have until midnight tonight to correct this situation." "What do you mean, correct the situation?" Michael asked, although he already knew the answer. "You're going to call Miss Ryan at the Boston Globe and tell her that you made a mistake, that what you thought you saw was actually something completely innocent. You're going to contact Agent Mitchell and tell her that you were confused and that there's no federal crime to investigate, and you're going to return to work tonight as if nothing has happened. And if I don't, Mr. Sullivan, you have a beautiful family. Your wife Mary works the night shift at Boston Medical Center, which means she walks to her car alone in a dark parking garage. Your son Patrick plays Little League Baseball at Murphy Field, which is only 2 blocks from your house. Your daughter Bridget walks to school every morning at exactly 7:45 a.m. Accidents happen, Mr. Sullivan. It would be terrible if something happened to one of them because you couldn't follow simple instructions." The line went dead, leaving Michael staring at the phone with the absolute certainty that he was dealing with people who would murder his family without hesitation if he continued to cooperate with federal authorities. At 10 a.m., Michael met with Agent Mitchell in a small coffee shop in downtown Boston. Agent Mitchell was a serious woman in her 40s who listened to Michael's story with the intensity of someone who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of breakthrough. "Mr. Sullivan, what you've discovered could be the key to bringing down a criminal organization that we've been investigating for over 5 years. But I have to be honest with you. Protecting witnesses in cases like this is extremely difficult, especially when the corruption reaches into law enforcement itself. Agent Mitchell explained that the FBI had been aware of rumors about a sophisticated body disposal operation in Boston, but they had never been able to find evidence or witnesses. Michael's photographs and testimony could provide the evidence needed to obtain search warrants and make arrests, but only if Michael was willing to testify in federal court. The problem, Mr. Sullivan, is that from the moment you agree to cooperate with us, you and your family become targets. We can provide protection, but our resources are limited, and the people you're dealing with have proven that they're willing to kill law enforcement officers who get in their way. Michael looked at the FBI agent across the table and realized that he was facing an impossible choice. If he continued to cooperate with federal authorities, his family would be murdered. If he withdrew his cooperation and returned to work, he would be killed as soon as he was no longer useful, and the criminal organization would continue operating with impunity. But there was a third option, one that Michael was beginning to understand might be his only chance to protect his family and ensure that justice was served. What do you think about the impossible choice Michael was facing? Would you have continued to cooperate with the FBI, knowing it would put your family in danger, or would you have tried to find another way to stop the criminals? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Michael's terrifying situation. Chapter 3. Hours 6 through 12 of Michael Sullivan's final day would test every survival instinct he had developed during 33 years of life in one of Boston's toughest neighborhoods. What began as an attempt to find a safe way to cooperate with federal authorities quickly became a desperate flight through the city. He had called home his entire life, pursued by professional killers who seemed to anticipate his every move. Michael left his meeting with Agent Mitchell at 11 a.m. with a plan that he hoped would protect his family, while still ensuring that the truth about the underground facility would eventually come to light. He had given Agent Mitchell copies of all his photographs and a detailed written statement about what he had discovered, but he had refused to agree to immediate federal protection for his family. "Agent Mitchell," Michael had explained, "if my family suddenly disappears into federal protection, everyone will know that I've cooperated with the FBI. That will get all of us killed. But if I can convince the people watching me that I'm going to keep quiet, maybe I can buy enough time for you to build a case that doesn't depend on my testimony." Agent Mitchell had been reluctant to agree to Michael's plan, but she understood his reasoning. "Mr. Sullivan, you're walking a very dangerous line. These people have resources and connections that reach into every level of law enforcement. If they suspect that you're playing games with them, they won't wait until midnight to eliminate you." Michael's first stop after leaving Agent Mitchell was his bank, where he withdrew $5,000 in cash from his savings account. He knew that using credit cards or checks would leave a trail that could be followed, and from this point forward, he was going to have to assume that every electronic transaction was being monitored. His second stop was the electronics store in downtown Boston, where he purchased a small digital recorder and several blank cassettes. If Michael didn't survive the next 18 hours, he was determined to leave behind evidence that would ensure the criminal organization could still be prosecuted. But it was as Michael was leaving the electronics store that he first noticed the coordination and sophistication of the surveillance operation that was tracking his every movement. The black sedan that had been following him since early morning had been joined by at least 3 other vehicles, and Michael could see men with radio equipment positioned at strategic locations throughout downtown Boston. The people tracking him weren't just watching, they were herding him, using their positioning to force him to move in directions they wanted him to go. When Michael tried to enter the subway system to lose his pursuers, he found that the entrances he approached always seemed to have maintenance work in progress that blocked his access. When he tried to enter buildings with multiple exits, security guards would suddenly appear to direct him away from alternative escape routes. At 12:30 p.m., Michael realized that he was being driven toward the waterfront area of South Boston, away from crowds and witnesses, toward industrial areas where a man could disappear without anyone noticing. He also realized that his pursuers were professionals, probably former military or law enforcement, who had resources and coordination that suggested they were working for someone with serious financial backing. Michael's knowledge of South Boston's streets and alleys, developed during a lifetime of living in the neighborhood, became his primary advantage in a cat-and-mouse game that was becoming more deadly with each passing hour. He used construction sites, subway tunnels, and the maze of narrow streets around Boston Harbor to stay ahead of his pursuers. But he could feel the net closing around him with every move he made. At 1:15 p.m., Michael made a crucial decision that probably extended his life by several hours. Instead of continuing to run aimlessly through the city, he decided to go on the offensive and gather evidence that would ensure his death wouldn't be in vain. Using his knowledge of Boston's construction industry and his connections with workers throughout the city, Michael began systematically investigating the people and companies involved in the underground facility project. He visited construction supply companies, equipment rental businesses, and union halls, asking careful questions about Morrison Construction and the federal project that was employing so many specialized workers. What Michael discovered during these conversations was more disturbing than what he had found in the hidden room at the construction site. The underground facility wasn't Morrison Construction's first project involving body disposal and murder. Over the past 5 years, Morrison had been involved in at least 6 similar projects throughout New England, all of them described as federal security facilities, and all of them built in remote locations with extraordinary security precautions. But more importantly, Michael learned that Morrison Construction was owned by a shell corporation that was controlled by the Torino crime family, one of the most powerful organized crime syndicates on the East Coast. The federal contracts were a facade that allowed the crime family to build sophisticated murder and disposal facilities while using government funds to pay for construction. At 2:45 p.m., Michael called Catherine Ryan at the Boston Globe from a payphone in South Station, using the noise and crowds of the train station to make it difficult for his pursuers to monitor his conversation. "Miss Ryan, I need you to know that what I told you this morning was just the beginning. The people behind this operation aren't just running a single facility, they're running a network of facilities throughout New England, all of them designed for murder and body disposal." Michael gave Ryan the names of the shell corporations, the locations of the other facilities, and the connections he had discovered between Morrison Construction and the Torino crime family. "Miss Ryan, if something happens to me, you need to know that this conspiracy involves federal officials who have been providing government contracts and legal protection for organized crime activities." Ryan took detailed notes during their conversation, but she also warned Michael that his investigation was putting him in even greater danger. "Mr. Sullivan, if the Torino family realizes that you've uncovered their entire operation, they're not going to wait until midnight to eliminate you. You need to get to a safe location immediately." But Michael had one more crucial stop to make before he could consider his own safety. He needed to create a record of everything he had discovered, a record that would survive even if he didn't. At 3:30 p.m., Michael arrived at the offices of his attorney, Robert McKenna, a man who had handled Michael's business affairs for over 10 years, and who could be trusted to follow instructions even under pressure from law enforcement or criminal organizations. "Bob," Michael said, handing McKenna a sealed envelope containing photographs, documents, and detailed written statements, "I'm going to give you some materials that I need you to keep safe. If anything happens to me, I want you to deliver these materials to Catherine Ryan at the Boston Globe and to FBI Special Agent Sarah Mitchell." McKenna could see the fear in Michael's eyes and the tension in his movements. "Michael, what kind of trouble are you in? Maybe I can help you find a way out of this situation." "Bob, the less you know about this, the safer you'll be. Just promise me that if something happens to me, you'll make sure these materials get to the right people. And promise me that you'll look after Mary and the kids." Michael left McKenna's office at 4:00 p.m., knowing that he had done everything possible to ensure that the truth would survive, even if he didn't. But he also knew that his investigation had probably sealed his fate. By uncovering the full scope of the criminal organization's activities, he had made himself too dangerous to be allowed to live under any circumstances. At 4:30 p.m., Michael made a phone call that he hoped would save his family's lives, even if it couldn't save his own. He called the mysterious voice that had threatened him that morning and delivered the message that he hoped would convince his enemies that he was ready to cooperate. "This is Michael Sullivan. I've thought about what you said, and I'm ready to do what you want. I'll call the reporter and the FBI agent and tell them I made a mistake. I'll go back to work tonight and finish the project, but I want your word that my family will be left alone." "Very good, Mr. Sullivan. You're making the smart choice. Report to work at 11:00 p.m. as usual, and this whole unpleasant situation will be forgotten." But Michael knew that the people he was dealing with had no intention of letting him live long enough to finish the project. They would wait until he had publicly recanted his story and eliminated any immediate law enforcement interest in the facility. And then they would kill him and dispose of his body in the very facility he had been hired to build. Michael had approximately 6.5 hours to live, and he was going to use every minute of that time to ensure that his death would bring down the criminal organization that had signed his death warrant. Thank you for staying with us this far in Michael's desperate final hours. Your engagement means everything to us, and we promise that the best and most heroic parts of this story are yet to come. What Michael accomplished in his final hours would not only ensure that justice was served, but would save the lives of countless future victims of this criminal conspiracy. Chapter 4. Hours 12 through 18 of Michael Sullivan's final day would transform him from a desperate man trying to survive into a strategic thinker determined to ensure that his death would serve a greater purpose. What Michael accomplished during these crucial hours would ultimately save more lives than he could have imagined, and would expose a criminal conspiracy that had been operating with impunity for over a decade. At 5:00 p.m., Michael found temporary refuge in St. Bridget's Catholic Church, the same church where he had been baptized, confirmed and married. Father Thomas O'Malley, who had known Michael since childhood, could see immediately that something was terribly wrong. "Michael, you look like a man who's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. What's troubling you, son?" Michael knelt in the confessional and, speaking in whispers, told Father O'Malley everything he had discovered and everything he had done to try to expose the truth. He didn't ask for absolution or forgiveness. He asked for something much more practical. "Father, I need you to promise me something. If anything happens to me tonight, I need you to contact Catherine Ryan at the Boston Globe and tell her that the story I told her this morning was true. I need you to tell her that Michael Sullivan died trying to do the right thing." Father O'Malley had served in South Boston long enough to understand when a man was making his final confession. "Michael, whatever you're planning to do, there has to be another way. Your family needs you alive, not dead as a martyr." "Father, my family needs to live in a world where criminals can't murder people with impunity. If I don't stop this tonight, these people will continue killing innocent people for years to come. Sometimes a man has to choose between his own life and the lives of people he'll never meet." Michael left the church at 6:00 p.m. and began the most dangerous part of his plan, using himself as bait to draw the criminal organization into making mistakes that would expose their entire operation. Michael's first stop was the electronics store in Cambridge, where he purchased additional recording equipment and a small transmitter that could broadcast audio signals to a receiver up to 5 miles away. He also bought a prepaid cell phone that couldn't be traced back to him and several disposable cameras. At 7 p.m., Michael called Catherine Ryan from his new phone and gave her the frequency for the transmitter he would be carrying. "Miss Ryan, starting at 10:30 p.m. tonight, I want you to monitor this frequency and record everything you hear. What you're going to hear will either be my death or the evidence you need to bring down this entire criminal organization." Ryan protested that Michael was taking an insane risk, but Michael had made his decision. "Miss Ryan, these people are going to kill me tonight whether I cooperate with them or not. The only question is whether my death accomplishes something useful or whether it just eliminates another witness to their crimes." Michael's next call was to FBI Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, whom he arranged to meet at a small restaurant in Cambridge. Agent Mitchell arrived with backup agents and surveillance equipment, but Michael made it clear that he wasn't looking for protection. "Agent Mitchell, I need you to position agents around the construction site tonight, but I need them to stay far enough away that they won't be detected. What's going to happen tonight will either give you all the evidence you need to prosecute this entire organization, or it will get me killed. Either way, you'll have what you need to bring them to justice." Agent Mitchell tried to convince Michael to accept federal protection and to testify in court rather than risking his life. But Michael had studied the situation carefully and understood that traditional law enforcement approaches wouldn't work against this level of corruption. "Agent Mitchell, how many witnesses against the Torino crime family have disappeared or changed their stories in the past 5 years? How many federal investigations have been mysteriously terminated or redirected? These people have been operating with impunity because they have protection inside law enforcement. The only way to bring them down is to catch them in the act of committing crimes that can't be explained away or covered up." At 8:30 p.m., Michael made the phone calls that would set his final plan in motion. He called Catherine Ryan and FBI Agent Mitchell, and speaking loudly enough to be overheard by anyone monitoring his phone, recanted his story about the underground facility. "Miss Ryan, I need to apologize for wasting your time this morning. I was confused and upset, and I misinterpreted what I saw at the construction site. There was no evidence of criminal activity, and I shouldn't have involved you in my personal problems." Michael made a similar call to Agent Mitchell, officially withdrawing his cooperation with the FBI investigation and stating that he no longer wished to be considered a witness in any federal case. But what Michael's enemies didn't know was that both calls were being recorded by the recipients, and that Michael was speaking in a code that he had arranged with both women earlier in the evening. When Michael said he was confused and upset, he was actually confirming that everything he had told them was true. When he said he had personal problems, he was indicating that he was under direct threat from the criminal organization. At 9 p.m., Michael returned to his house in South Boston for what he knew would be the last time. Mary was getting ready for her night shift at the hospital, and the children were doing homework in the living room. Michael spent an hour with his family, trying to memorize every detail of their faces and voices, knowing that these would be his final moments of peace and happiness. "Dad, are you okay?" his daughter Bridget asked. "You look sad." Michael hugged his children tighter than he ever had before. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just want you to remember that your daddy loves you more than anything in the world, and that everything I do is to make sure you have a good life." Mary could see the tension in her husband's face and the forced quality of his smiles. "Michael, what's wrong? You've been acting strange all day." "Mary, I need you to promise me something. If anything happens to me, I want you to take the kids and go stay with your sister in Maine for a few weeks. Don't ask questions, just go. and I want you to know that you're the best thing that ever happened to me." At 10 p.m., Michael kissed his wife and children goodbye and left for what everyone believed was just another night of work at the construction site. But Michael was carrying recording equipment, cameras, and a transmitter that would broadcast everything that happened to him directly to Catherine Ryan and the FBI. As Michael drove through the empty streets of South Boston toward the construction site, he thought about his father, who had taught him that a man's character was measured not by what he accomplished when life was easy, but by what he was willing to sacrifice when doing the right thing required everything he had. Michael Sullivan was about to prove that he was his father's son. At 10:30 p.m., Michael activated his transmitter and began the final phase of his plan. Catherine Ryan and FBI Special Agent Sarah Mitchell were listening from their respective locations, recording every word that would be transmitted over the next several hours. "This is Michael Sullivan," he said quietly into the transmitter. "It's 10:30 p.m. on November 13th, 1995. I'm approaching the construction site where I discovered evidence of multiple murders and a sophisticated body disposal operation. If you're hearing this recording, it means that I didn't survive the night. But it also means that you have the evidence you need to bring these criminals to justice." Michael parked his truck outside the construction site and walked toward the entrance, where the same security guards who had been checking his identification for 3 weeks were waiting to let him in for the last time. "Evening, Sullivan," Tony Marcelli said, his voice carrying a tone that Michael had never heard before. "Mr. Morrison is waiting for you down in the facility. He wants to have a word with you before you start work tonight." Michael walked through the construction site toward the underground facility, knowing that he was walking toward his death, but also knowing that every step was being recorded and transmitted to people who would ensure that justice was eventually served. At 10:45 p.m., Michael descended into the underground facility for the final time, carrying with him the evidence that would destroy the criminal organization that had sealed his fate. The final confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 5. The last 6 hours of Michael Sullivan's life would prove to be the most important hours in the fight against organized crime in Boston's history. What happened in the depths of that underground facility between 11 p.m. on November 13th and 5 a.m. on November 14th, 1995, would not only cost Michael his life, but would provide federal prosecutors with the evidence they needed to dismantle a criminal empire that had operated with impunity for over a decade. Michael descended into the underground facility at 10:47 p.m., his transmitter broadcasting every sound to Catherine Ryan and FBI Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, who were listening from their respective monitoring stations with growing horror and admiration for the courage of the man who was knowingly walking into a death trap to ensure that justice would be served. The facility was different than it had been during Michael's previous visits. The normal construction lighting had been replaced with harsh spotlights that created deep shadows and made it impossible to see into the corners of the large underground space. Instead of the usual handful of workers, the facility was filled with at least 20 men, all of them carrying weapons and all of them positioned as if they were expecting trouble. James Morrison was waiting in the center of the facility, but he was no longer the polite, professional contractor who had hired Michael 3 weeks earlier. This was a man who had dropped all pretense of legitimacy and was preparing to commit murder with the cold efficiency of someone who had done it many times before. "Mr. Sullivan," Morrison said, his voice echoing in the concrete chamber, "I understand you had some concerns about our project. I thought it would be helpful if we discussed those concerns privately, without any interference from reporters or federal agents." Michael looked around the facility, taking note of the positions of Morrison's men and the equipment that had been brought in for what was obviously planned as an execution and body disposal. But he also noticed that several of Morrison's men were carrying recording equipment of their own, apparently planning to document Michael's death for the entertainment or instruction of their criminal associates. "Mr. Morrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I called Miss Ryan and Agent Mitchell this afternoon and told them that I was mistaken about what I thought I saw here. I'm ready to finish the stonework and complete the project." Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth or humor in the expression. "Mr. Sullivan, we both know that you've discovered more than you should have discovered, and that you've shared that information with people who could cause us serious problems. Unfortunately, that makes you a liability that we can't afford to ignore." What Morrison and his men didn't know was that Michael's transmitter was broadcasting their conversation to federal agents who were positioning themselves around the construction site, and to Catherine Ryan, who was recording every word for the story that would expose the entire criminal conspiracy. But Morrison wasn't finished with his explanation. Apparently, he wanted Michael to understand the full scope of the operation he had stumbled into before he died. "Mr. Sullivan, what you discovered in this facility is just one part of a much larger operation. Over the past 5 years, we've eliminated over 200 people who posed threats to our organization. Federal agents, prosecutors, witnesses, journalists, and politicians who couldn't be bought or intimidated." Morrison gestured toward the hidden room where Michael had found the human remains. "This facility and 5 others like it throughout New England have allowed us to dispose of our problems permanently and without any trace. The beauty of the operation is that we use federal government contracts to pay for construction, so the taxpayers are actually funding the facilities that we use to eliminate threats to our organization." Michael realized that Morrison was providing a complete confession to multiple murders and a detailed description of a criminal conspiracy that involved federal contract fraud, political corruption, and systematic assassination of law enforcement officers and government officials. "But Mr. Morrison," Michael said, making sure his voice was clear for the transmitter, "you're talking about murdering federal agents and prosecutors. That's going to bring the full weight of the federal government down on your organization." Morrison laughed, a sound that was more chilling than any threat could have been. "Mr. Sullivan, we own enough federal agents and prosecutors to ensure that investigations never get very far. Do you think it's a coincidence that witnesses against our organization always seem to disappear or change their stories? Do you think it's luck that federal investigations into our activities always seem to be terminated or redirected?" Morrison began naming names: federal agents who were on his payroll, prosecutors who had been bought or intimidated, and politicians who had received campaign contributions in exchange for protection from law enforcement scrutiny. The list included some of the most respected names in Boston law enforcement and politics, people who had been secretly working for organized crime while maintaining their public reputations as defenders of justice. "We've been planning this operation for over 10 years, Mr. Sullivan. We identified key personnel in every level of law enforcement and government, and we systematically corrupted or eliminated anyone who posed a threat to our operations. What you discovered here isn't just a body disposal facility, it's the final piece of a system that makes us untouchable." But Morrison's arrogance was about to become his downfall. As he continued to brag about the scope and sophistication of his organization's activities, he was providing federal prosecutors with a detailed roadmap for dismantling the entire criminal empire. At 11:30 p.m., Morrison decided that he had shared enough information with his doomed witness. "Mr. Sullivan, it's time for you to join the other people who discovered too much about our operations." Morrison's men moved to surround Michael, but Michael had one final card to play. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a device that Morrison immediately recognized as a transmitter. "Mr. Morrison, everything you've said tonight has been broadcast live to the Boston Globe and to FBI Special Agent Sarah Mitchell. By now, federal agents are probably surrounding this facility, and your entire organization has been exposed. For a moment, Morrison stared at the transmitter in Michael's hand with the expression of a man who had just realized that his carefully planned criminal empire was about to collapse around him. Then his expression hardened with the cold fury of a professional killer who had been outmaneuvered by an amateur. "Mr. Sullivan, that was very clever. But it doesn't change the fact that you're going to die tonight, and it doesn't change the fact that we have enough people inside law enforcement to make this evidence disappear before it ever reaches a courtroom." Morrison pulled out a pistol and aimed it at Michael's chest. "Kill him," he ordered his men, "and destroy that transmitter." What happened next would be remembered as one of the most heroic final stands in the history of American law enforcement. Michael Sullivan, armed with nothing but a trowel and his knowledge of the underground facility he had helped to build, fought for his life against 20 armed men while continuing to broadcast evidence of their crimes to the outside world. The fight lasted for over an hour, with Michael using his knowledge of the facility's layout and his experience with construction equipment to stay alive far longer than anyone had expected. He managed to barricade himself in the hidden room where he had first discovered evidence of the murders, and from there he continued to broadcast information about the criminal organization's activities. "This is Michael Sullivan," he said into his transmitter as gunfire echoed through the underground facility. "Morrison has admitted to over 200 murders. He's named federal agents and prosecutors who are working for his organization. Don't let them cover this up. Don't let my death be for nothing." At 12:47 a.m., Morrison's men finally broke through Michael's barricade and cornered him in the hidden room. But even as he was dying, Michael continued to fight, using his final moments to destroy evidence that Morrison needed to protect his organization and to ensure that additional proof of the crimes would be discovered by federal investigators. Michael Sullivan died at 1:23 a.m. on November 14, 1995, but his transmitter continued broadcasting for another 3 hours, recording Morrison's attempts to clean up the crime scene and eliminate evidence of the night's activities. By dawn, FBI agents had surrounded the construction site and were arresting everyone involved in the criminal conspiracy. Catherine Ryan's story, based on Michael's transmitted testimony and the evidence he had provided earlier, was on the front page of the Boston Globe's morning edition. Federal prosecutors had enough evidence to indict 63 people on charges ranging from murder to federal contract fraud to conspiracy to obstruct justice. The investigation that followed Michael's death was the largest organized crime prosecution in Massachusetts history. Morrison and 12 of his associates were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 23 federal agents and prosecutors were arrested for corruption, including 3 who were sentenced to death for their role in the murders of law enforcement officers. The Torino crime family, which had controlled organized crime activities throughout New England for over 30 years, was completely dismantled. Federal prosecutors seized assets worth over $200 million, money that was used to compensate the families of victims and to fund expanded law enforcement efforts against organized crime. But perhaps the most important outcome of Michael Sullivan's sacrifice was the establishment of new protocols for investigating organized crime and political corruption. The FBI created a specialized task force dedicated to rooting out corruption within law enforcement itself, and federal prosecutors were given expanded authority to investigate cases that might involve compromised local officials. Michael Sullivan was posthumously awarded the FBI's highest civilian honor for his role in exposing the criminal conspiracy. A memorial was erected at the construction site where he died, honoring not just Michael, but all the victims of the criminal organization he had helped to bring down. Mary Sullivan and her children were provided with federal protection until all members of the criminal organization had been arrested and prosecuted. Mary eventually remarried and moved to a small town in Maine, where she works as a nurse and raises her children with the knowledge that their father died as a hero who saved countless lives. Patrick Sullivan, Michael's son, grew up to become an FBI agent specializing in organized crime investigations. He often says that his father's example taught him that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by soldiers or police officers, but by ordinary citizens who find the courage to do what's right when it costs them everything. Bridget Sullivan became a prosecutor who specializes in political corruption cases. She has dedicated her career to ensuring that the kind of systematic corruption that killed her father can never again operate with impunity in American law enforcement. The underground facility where Michael Sullivan died was filled with concrete and converted into a memorial park dedicated to victims of organized crime. Visitors can see a plaque that reads, "In memory of Michael Patrick Sullivan and all those who gave their lives in the fight against organized crime. Their sacrifice ensures that justice will never be silenced." Michael Sullivan's story serves as a reminder that heroism is not about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway. Michael knew that confronting the criminal organization would cost him his life. But he also knew that his death could serve a purpose greater than his own survival. His story also proves that even the most powerful and sophisticated criminal organizations can be brought down when ordinary citizens find the courage to stand up against them. Michael Sullivan was just a mason from South Boston, but his willingness to sacrifice his life for justice brought down a criminal empire and saved the lives of countless future victims. Most importantly, Michael Sullivan's story shows that truth has a power that transcends death. Even though Michael didn't live to see the criminals prosecuted or the corruption exposed, his courage ensured that justice would be served and that his family could live in a world where criminals could no longer murder with impunity. Sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is ensure that the truth survives, even when they don't. Michael Sullivan proved that when a single person finds the courage to do what's right, even the most powerful criminal conspiracies can be brought to justice. What would you have done in Michael Sullivan's situation? Would you have had the courage to sacrifice your life to expose corruption and save the lives of people you would never meet? Would you have been willing to leave your family behind to ensure that they could live in a safer world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of courage and sacrifice moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming stories of ordinary people who found the strength to do extraordinary things in the fight for justice. And don't forget to watch our next recommended video about the incredible journey from poverty to success of a man who refused to let his circumstances define his destiny. You won't believe how a garbage collector became one of America's most successful entrepreneurs.